The 1970s promised safer, smarter cars, but instead gave us some of the most dangerous machines ever built. Automakers rushed designs, cut corners, and created vehicles that were weak, unstable, and sometimes deadly. Exploding fuel tanks, collapsing steering columns, and bodies that crumpled like paper made driving in the 70s a real gamble. Here are the 10 worst cars of the 1970s that killed many and proved progress can be deadly.
The Ford LTD2, built between 1977 and 1979, stands as one of the most haunting reminders of the American automotive industry's confused identity in the late 1970s, an era when the idea of bigger is safer had begun to unravel. On the surface, the LTD2 was everything Detroit had been promising for decades, a massive, gleaming monument to personal luxury, with the kind of size and presence that filled a driveway and intimidated traffic. But beneath that vast sheet metal lay a car that was already out of time. Ponderous, heavy, clumsy, and shockingly unsafe in ways that belied its hulking form. In trying to carry on the grandeur of the big American luxury coupe, Ford instead created a vehicle that looked indestructible, but in reality behaved like a slow-moving catastrophe. When introduced in 1977, the LTD2 was Ford's attempt to modernize the traditional full-size American car for a world that was changing faster than Detroit wanted to admit. The oil crises of the 1970s had left consumers wary of large cars with big engines. But instead of embracing efficiency and refinement, Ford chose to double down on the old formula. The LTD2 was built on the bones of the Torino and Montego, both of which were already considered oversized. The result was a car that was mid-size only by Ford's increasingly meaningless standards, stretching over 18 feet long, tipping the scales at nearly 2 tons and wider than some delivery vans. Its squared-off styling, with enormous overhangs, chrome-laden grills, and a stance that looked like it was perpetually dragging its tail, gave it a kind of brash, self-important beauty. It was the automotive equivalent of a retired heavyweight boxer wearing a fur coat. Still impressive to look at, but not nearly as capable as it once was. Under the hood, buyers could choose from a range of big displacement V8 engines, including the 351 and 400 cubic inch options. On paper, this should have meant performance, but by 1977, the combination of emissions controls and low compression had strangled power output to dismal levels. The base 351 produced barely over 150 horsepower, a figure that might have been acceptable in a compact, but in a car weighing over 4,000 pounds, it meant a sluggish, gasping performance. Acceleration was glacial, passing required planning, and fuel economy hovered in the low teens, sometimes single digits if the car was pushed hard. Yet it was not the lack of speed that made the LTD2 truly dangerous. It was the way it handled, or rather refused to handle. The steering was infamously vague, with a massive amount of play between the wheel and the front tires. Drivers would often find themselves sawing back and forth at the wheel on the highway just to maintain a straight line. The power-assisted system was so overboosted that there was almost no feedback whatsoever. It was like steering a couch with a spoon. The suspension, tuned for comfort above all else, allowed the car to wallow and float like a boat in a storm. On winding roads or emergency maneuvers, it leaned so dramatically that it could feel like the entire body was about to roll off the frame. Contemporary reviewers joked that it handled as if it had one flat tire and one wheel in a swamp, and owners weren't far behind in their criticism. One frustrated driver, interviewed years later, recalled, "You didn't drive an LTD2. You guided it and prayed. It was like steering a barge through a fog bank." But the real horror lay in its safety record. The LTD2's immense hood and long front end were not the energy-absorbing marvels that Ford's marketing suggested. In crash tests conducted later by independent safety analysts, it was discovered that the steering column had a disturbing tendency to collapse inward during frontal impacts, not away from the driver, but toward them. This meant that in a severe head-on crash, the steering wheel could impale the driver, transforming what should have been a survivable collision into a fatal one. The massive hood, rather than crumpling to absorb impact, folded upward violently, often shearing through the windshield line like a guillotine. In short, the LTD2's imposing front end was not a shield, it was a trap. Inside, the car offered the illusion of safety and comfort. The cabin was an ocean of vinyl, chrome trim, and fake wood grain. The dashboard was thick and plush-looking, but beneath that soft padding lurked brittle materials that shattered dangerously in accidents. Seatbelts were often ignored by owners, who were lured into a false sense of security by the car's bulk. The visibility was poor thanks to thick pillars and an enormous hood, making it difficult to judge distances or see smaller cars, pedestrians, or obstacles. For a car meant to exude prestige, it was deeply unrefined. Drivers described the experience as floating rather than driving, a feeling of detachment that was both luxurious and terrifying. The kind of numbness that might be relaxing on a long cruise, but deadly in an emergency situation. By 1979, the LTD2's reputation had sunk under the weight of reality. Rising fuel costs, changing tastes, and damning safety reviews made it a relic almost the moment it was built. Ford quietly phased it out, focusing instead on smaller, more efficient cars like the Fairmont and later the downsized Crown Victoria. The LTD2's massive size and lethargic handling became a cautionary tale, an embodiment of everything that had gone wrong with Detroit's obsession with excess. Even among collectors today, it's a car rarely sought after, not because it lacks character, but because it symbolizes an era of delusion, when American automakers mistook bulk for brilliance and equated length with luxury. And yet, for all its flaws, the LTD2 remains a fascinating artifact of its time. It represents a last gasp of old-school American car making, a machine built not for logic or safety, but for presence and pride. On a quiet night, when its V8 rumbles softly and the chrome glints under the streetlights, you can still sense the grandeur Ford was trying to preserve. But the moment you take it onto a highway, with that loose steering and swaying suspension, the illusion falls apart. It's not a car built for the modern world. It's a ghost from a time when size was supposed to mean security, and when Detroit's giants didn't yet understand that even the biggest car can be frighteningly fragile.
The Chevrolet Chevette, produced from 1976 to 1987, was General Motors' desperate attempts to prove that America could build a small, economical car to compete with the efficient imports flooding in from Japan and Europe. Unfortunately, what they delivered was a vehicle so cheaply built and structurally frail that it became a national punchline. The Chevette was a car that promised thrift but delivered trauma, a tiny, rattling machine whose only real skill was reminding drivers just how far Detroit had fallen. It was marketed as America's new kind of small car, but what many buyers discovered was that it was also America's new kind of death trap. When the Chevette debuted in 1976, the world was still reeling from the oil crisis, and American buyers were finally warming to compact cars. Honda, Toyota, and Datsun had already conquered the market with reliable, well-engineered models that were efficient yet surprisingly refined. General Motors, eager to reclaim its dominance, rushed the Chevette into production. Built on a modified version of the T-Car platform developed by Opel, the Chevette was meant to be simple, cheap, and global, a car that could be built and sold in dozens of countries with minimal variation. The problem was that GM stripped it down even further for the US market, turning an already basic design into something that barely met the definition of a car. Its body panels were made of some of the thinnest steel ever used on a GM production vehicle, and the entire structure was alarmingly weak. Crash tests and real-world accidents quickly revealed the grim truth. The Chevette had almost no energy absorption capacity. In even moderate collisions, the front end would collapse into the cabin, the steering column often driving backward toward the driver's chest. The doors frequently jammed shut during impacts, trapping occupants inside the twisted shell. In rollovers, the roof could cave in like aluminum foil, providing virtually no survival space. One safety engineer at the time reportedly quipped, "The Chevette doesn't crumple, it disintegrates." Owners, too, quickly began to notice that the car's fragility wasn't limited to crash scenarios. The rear axle, a cheap stamped steel design, was prone to failure under stress. It could bend or even snap during hard acceleration or after hitting potholes, sending the car into unpredictable slides. Suspension components wore out prematurely, and the steering system, which was already imprecise, became dangerously loose as the miles piled up. The brakes were marginal, fading quickly on downhill stretches, and the electrical system was notoriously unreliable. In many cases, the Chevette began to fall apart within a few years, not because of abuse, but because it simply wasn't built to last. Performance was equally underwhelming. Early Chevettes were powered by a 1.4 or 1.6-liter four-cylinder engine that produced as little as 52 horsepower. Acceleration from 0 to 60 took over 19 seconds, and the engine groaned like it was doing something heroic just to keep the car moving. On the highway, the Chevette struggled to maintain 60 miles per hour without sounding like it was about to explode. Passing another car required an open runway and a lot of luck. And despite its small size, it didn't even return particularly impressive fuel economy, mostly because it was so poorly engineered aerodynamically. Inside, the Chevette was a masterclass in cost-cutting. There was no sound insulation, so every vibration and squeak echoed through the cabin like a cheap tin drum. The seats were thin and uncomfortable, the dashboard was made of brittle plastic that cracked in sunlight, and the carpeting was so cheap it often detached from the floor after a few months. Wind noise was constant even with the windows closed, and water leaks through the doors and roof were common. In cold weather, the heater struggled to function. In hot weather, the ventilation system was so weak it felt like being trapped in a metal oven. But the real tragedy of the Chevette wasn't just its discomfort or unreliability. It was the illusion it sold. Chevrolet promised Americans that this car represented progress, a practical and modern answer to the fuel crisis. The ad showed happy young families zipping along highways, touting simplicity and economy as virtues. Yet what many buyers discovered was that it was also America's new kind of death trap. When the Chevette debuted in 1976, the world was still reeling from the oil crisis, and American buyers were finally warming to compact cars. Honda, Toyota, and Datsun had already conquered the market with reliable, well-engineered models that were efficient and surprisingly refined. General Motors, eager to reclaim its dominance, rushed the Chevette into production. Built on a modified version of the T-Car platform developed by Opel, the Chevette was meant to be simple, cheap, and global, a car that could be built and sold in dozens of countries with minimal variation. The problem was that GM stripped it down even further for the US market, turning an already basic design into something that barely met the definition of a car. The Chevette's crumple zones were often joked to be the passengers themselves. In serious accidents, the car offered virtually no structural protection. Photographs of wrecked Chevettes from the late 1970s are chilling. The passenger compartment flattened, the dashboard pressed against the seats, and the thin metal peeled away like a crushed soda can. Drivers who survived crashes often spoke with disbelief. One owner from Michigan recalled, "I hit a light pole at maybe 25 miles an hour, and the front end folded up like paper. The engine was in my lap, and the doors wouldn't open. I had to crawl out the back window." Another said, "You didn't feel safe in a Chevette. You just hoped no one would hit you." Even mechanics loathed the car, describing it as a disposable vehicle that was impossible to repair properly because everything was built too cheaply. Despite these issues, the Chevette sold surprisingly well. Over 2.5 million units were produced, largely because it was cheap and accessible. For many Americans, it was their first new car, an entry point into car ownership at a time when prices were rising. But as the years went on, the Chevette's reputation sank under the weight of reality. By the mid-1980s, it was considered an embarrassment, mocked on late-night TV and used as shorthand for failure. It became the butt of jokes, the kind of car people bought only because they had no choice. When production finally ended in 1987, few mourned its passing. By then, even GM had stopped defending it, quietly replacing it with more competent models like the Cavalier and the Geo Metro. Today, the Chevette has achieved a kind of ironic cult status, beloved not for its quality, but for how profoundly it represented an era of decline. Seeing one on the road today is a surreal experience. Its paper-thin doors, tiny wheels, and awkward proportions seem like a time capsule from a world that confused minimalism with neglect. In the end, the Chevrolet Chevette was not merely a bad car, it was a warning. It showed what happens when an automaker builds to a price instead of a principle, when survival in the marketplace outweighs survival on the road. It was a car that taught a generation that cheapness can come at a deadly cost. As one journalist later wrote, the Chevette didn't just save gas, it saved General Motors from itself, by reminding them just how low they could go before people stopped calling it a car.
The Rover SD1, produced from 1976 to 1986, was supposed to be the proud rebirth of British luxury motoring, a futuristic grand tourer that could stand toe-to-toe with the finest from BMW and Mercedes-Benz. On paper, it had everything: a sleek, modern, fastback design inspired by the Ferrari Daytona, a smooth V8 engine borrowed from the legendary Rover P6, and a bold vision of what the British motor industry could be. It was the car that was meant to save Rover. Instead, it became a symbol of everything that went wrong with British Leyland, a company that could dream big but build disastrously. What began as an ambitious engineering statement ended up as one of the most dangerously unreliable luxury cars of its era. When the SD1 was unveiled in 1976, it looked like a car from another world. Its wedge-shaped body and sloping rear hatch were unlike anything coming out of Britain at the time. The design, by David Bosch, gave it a low, aggressive stance that evoked Italian exotic cars rather than traditional British sedans. It was roomy, aerodynamic, and forward-thinking, a true executive express. The press adored it. It even won the coveted European Car of the Year award in 1977. But the honeymoon was short. The problems began almost immediately, not just in small ways, but in ways that could kill you. Rover's engineers had designed a fine car. The problem was that the factory at Solihull, where it was built, was a nightmare. This was the height of Britain's industrial unrest: constant strikes, worker sabotage, missing parts, and shocking quality control. Cars would roll off the production line missing bolts, wiring looms would be half-connected, and trim panels were sometimes attached with tape. Workers were known to leave half-finished sandwiches inside the doors, and mechanics often joked that a brand new Rover SD1 was only half complete but fully unreliable. Buyers who picked them up fresh from the dealer often returned within weeks, sometimes days, with serious issues. Electrical failures, suspension collapse, brake malfunctions, or engines that refused to start. Electrical faults were so rampant that fires became almost expected. The wiring harness, poorly insulated and cheaply manufactured, was routed dangerously close to hot engine components. Owners reported spontaneous electrical shorts that melted fuses, ignited dashboards, or even set the engine bay ablaze. One particularly notorious issue involved the fuel pump, a cheaply sourced component prone to leaking and sometimes exploding. Mechanics told horror stories of SD1s that caught fire while idling at traffic lights or sitting in garages overnight. It earned the car the grim nickname, the British Fire Starter. Even when it wasn't catching fire, the SD1 was a mechanical disaster. The suspension, designed for comfort, was poorly built and frequently collapsed under normal use. The car's handling was unpredictable, sometimes beautifully composed, sometimes terrifyingly unstable. The steering rack, in particular, was dangerously inconsistent. Due to poor machining tolerances and subpar materials, it could seize without warning at speed. Imagine cruising along a motorway at 70 miles per hour and suddenly discovering that the steering wheel wouldn't move. That was a genuine, documented danger of early SD1s.
Some owners barely avoided fatal accidents when the front end locked up mid-turn, sending the car skidding helplessly towards guardrails or ditches. Inside, the SD1 looked modern and spacious, but the illusion of luxury fell apart almost immediately. The plastic dashboard cracked in sunlight, the seats wore out in months, and the headliner often detached from the roof and sagged like a hammock. Switches failed, door handles broke off, and air vents rattled constantly. Water leaks were endemic. Many owners joked that owning an SD1 was like owning a submarine with windows. Even the paint was poor, with panels fading or peeling after just a few years. It was the kind of car that looked magnificent in a showroom and tragic in a driveway. And yet, beneath all this chaos, there was potential. The car's mechanical heart, the 3.5-liter aluminum V8, originally a Buick design, was actually a masterpiece of smooth, torquey power. When the car ran properly, it was fast, refined, and genuinely enjoyable to drive. It could sprint to 60 miles per hour in under 9 seconds and cruise all day with a satisfying growl. The chassis design, too, was capable of greatness, especially in later V-Test versions. But the constant mechanical failures and shocking reliability issues destroyed any goodwill it might have earned. The Rover SD1's decline wasn't just mechanical, it was also cultural. The car became a symbol of Britain's collapsing industrial confidence. By the early 1980s, police forces across the UK had adopted the SD1 as a pursuit car because of its speed and V8 performance. But even they suffered from its unreliability. Patrol officers complained that the cars would overheat during chases, lose power steering, or simply stall without warning. One ex-traffic officer memorably said, "The SD1 could catch any criminal if it didn't catch fire first."
The Plymouth Volare and Dodge Aspen, introduced in 1976, were meant to be Chrysler's great redemption story. Compact, efficient, modern replacements for the aging Valiant and Dart. On paper, they promised everything the American public wanted in the post-oil crisis era: smaller size, better fuel economy, and improved handling. But in reality, these cars became rolling disasters that nearly destroyed Chrysler's reputation and sent the company teetering toward bankruptcy. They were supposed to lead the brand into a new era of responsible engineering. Instead, they became the perfect symbols of corporate negligence, shoddy workmanship, and design shortcuts taken in the name of cost-cutting. The Volare and Aspen shared nearly everything: platform, engines, transmissions, and styling. They were badge-engineered twins dressed in slightly different trim. Their design looked promising when they debuted. The sleek, squared-off bodies carried a hint of European inspiration, the interiors were clean and modern, and Chrysler bragged that these were the new generation of American compacts. The company poured millions into marketing, boasting of advanced engineering and quiet, smooth ride. Car magazines initially praised the idea: a smaller, lighter, more refined Mopar sedan for families who didn't want a gas-guzzling monster. Chrysler desperately needed a win in 1976, and the Volare and Aspen seemed like the answer. But the truth was darker. Behind the flashy marketing and showroom sparkle lay a rushed, underdeveloped product built in factories crippled by low morale, labor unrest, and cost-cutting orders from executives who were more concerned about quarterly profits than long-term quality. Chrysler had slashed engineering time, and quality control was almost non-existent. What rolled out of the plants were cars that looked fine on delivery day, but began falling apart almost immediately. Within months of the first deliveries, dealerships were flooded with complaints: rust appearing on cars less than a year old, transmissions leaking, engines misfiring, and suspension parts breaking under normal use. The mechanical issues were terrifying.
One of the most notorious problems was the steering column, which could lock up without warning during a turn, literally freezing the steering wheel mid-motion. Drivers would find themselves unable to correct or straighten the car, leading to countless accidents. It was such a widespread issue that Consumer Reports labeled the Volare and Aspen dangerous to drive. Another horrifying defect involved the brakes. The front disc brakes were undersized for the car's weight, overheated quickly, and faded or failed completely under stress. Chrysler issued multiple recalls, but they only addressed symptoms rather than the deeper design flaws. Even worse was the frame construction. The Volare and Aspen suffered from structural cracks that appeared after only a few thousand miles. Poor welding and thin-gauge steel meant the subframes could literally fracture, especially around the front suspension mounts. In some cases, the front wheels shifted alignment mid-drive, causing violent shaking and steering instability. Owners described the experience as trying to steer a collapsing building. Chrysler quietly replaced subframes on thousands of cars under warranty, but the damage to public trust was already irreversible. Then came the fires. The carburetors, cheap Carter two-barrel units, were infamous for leaking fuel onto the intake manifold. The leaks could ignite spontaneously, especially when the engine was hot or after being parked for a few minutes. Dozens of reports surfaced of Volares and Aspens going up in flames in driveways and parking lots. The combination of electrical faults and poor insulation didn't help. Dashboards shorted out, wipers stopped working in the rain, and ignition systems failed without warning. The cars were so unreliable that mechanics often joked that volare, which means to fly in Italian, is appropriate because that's what they do when they catch fire. And if mechanical failure didn't kill the car, rust certainly did. The Volare and Aspen were among the most rust-prone vehicles of the decade. Their poorly treated sheet metal, combined with inadequate undercoating, meant that in northern climates the cars began rusting within months. Fender wells, door bottoms, and trunk lids would bubble and corrode after the first winter. Some owners found holes in the floor after only 2 years. In places like Michigan, New York, and Pennsylvania, mechanics used to joke that you didn't change oil on a Volare, you just waited until the rust leaked it out. By the late 1970s, Chrysler had issued an astonishing number of recalls, over 20 separate bulletins covering steering, braking, fuel systems, seatbelt anchors, and corrosion protection. Yet even these efforts couldn't save the car's reputation. Owners were furious. A 1978 owner's letter to Chrysler, later quoted in a consumer safety report, said, "My Volare is a death trap. The steering locks up, the brakes are mush, and the car rusted through before I made my last payment." Another owner recounted how his Volare's frame split while driving at 55 miles per hour, forcing him to wrestle the car to a stop as it veered uncontrollably across 2 lanes. Consumer Reports, which initially viewed the cars with cautious optimism, ultimately condemned them in one of the harshest reviews it had ever published. The magazine not only listed them as not recommended, but warned readers explicitly that they posed serious safety risks. That label became a death sentence in the marketplace. Sales plummeted, and Chrysler's already precarious finances went into freefall. What made the Volare and Aspen such tragedies was that they could have been good. Beneath the disastrous execution was a genuinely smart idea, a mid-size unibody car with decent ride comfort and optional V8 power, perfect for the late 1970s fuel-conscious market. But Chrysler's management ignored quality control in favor of rushing production and cutting costs. They had bet the company's future on 2 cars that weren't ready for the road. The result was not only a flood of warranty claims and recalls, but also a permanent stain on Chrysler's credibility. The long-term effects were devastating. By 1979, Chrysler was bankrupt and begging for a government bailout. The Volare and Aspen became cautionary examples in business schools and engineering courses, proof that corporate arrogance and rushed design could destroy even a giant automaker. The company eventually recovered under Lee Iacocca's leadership with the K-cars and minivans of the 1980s, but the shadow of the Volare Aspen lingered for decades. Today, the Plymouth Volare and Dodge Aspen have achieved a strange, infamous immortality among car enthusiasts. They are sometimes displayed at worst car shows or written about as singles of everything wrong with the American auto industry of the 1970s: flashy advertising, cost-cutting over safety, and the illusion of innovation masking deep decay. Enthusiasts joke that owning one today is like owning a piece of tragic history, a relic from a time when Detroit's biggest problem wasn't foreign competition, but itself. The Renault Le Car, known as the Renault 5 in Europe, was supposed to bring a bit of French flair and efficiency to the American market. In theory, it was the perfect import for a fuel-conscious era, lightweight, cheap to run, and cheerful in personality. But in practice, it became one of the most unsafe and unnerving cars ever to wear a smiling grille. Beneath its friendly face was a structure so thin and flimsy that it barely qualified as metal. The doors were as fragile as a soda can, the roof buckled under light pressure, and the bumpers were decorative at best. American crash tests revealed that even minor impacts could twist the frame beyond repair. And in rear-end collisions, the poorly shielded fuel tank could rupture and ignite instantly. Owners soon realized that the Le Car didn't just feel fragile, it was fragile. Many describe driving one on the highway as like sitting in a tin kite during a windstorm. Its narrow track and soft suspension made it sway and bounce uncontrollably, especially when taking corners or dealing with gusts of wind. The front-wheel drive layout gave it decent traction in the rain, but when pushed too hard, the entire chassis felt like it wanted to escape in a different direction from the wheels. Inside, things weren't much better. The driving position was awkward, with pedals set too close and the steering wheel angled strangely upward. The dashboard, made of brittle plastic, would crack under sunlight, while the heating system was famous for alternating between freezing and boiling temperatures with no middle ground. Mechanically, the Le Car was at least simple, but simplicity couldn't save it from neglect. Rust spread quickly through the thin body panels, and the wiring system was prone to short circuits, often causing spontaneous electrical failures mid-drive. One owner from Ohio recalled, "I hit a pothole, and the lights went out, the radio died, and the wipers started going on their own. I didn't know if I should stop or call an exorcist." The car's lack of stability made emergency maneuvers terrifying. Sudden lane changes or panic braking could send it into a skid, and its drum brakes faded quickly on steep descents. Even the seatbelts were poorly anchored, tearing loose during violent crashes. Yet despite all of this, there was an undeniable charm to the Le Car's optimism. It represented the era's fascination with European simplicity, with a touch of quirkiness that made it endearing to a few brave souls. Students, artists, and minimalists loved its cartoonish proportions and fuel economy, which could reach over 40 miles per gallon if driven gently. It was cheap, easy to park, and carried an air of defiant individuality, until the moment its steering column locked or the engine caught fire. By the mid-1980s, the Renault Le Car's reputation in America was unsalvageable. Dealerships couldn't give them away, and mechanics often refused to work on them, calling them a French joke told at the driver's expense. When Renault finally pulled out of the U.S. market, the Le Car was quietly forgotten, left to rust behind barns and garages across the country. Today, it's a curiosity from a time when people were willing to trade safety for personality. A car that looked like a toy, drove like a hazard, and burned like a torch.
The Oldsmobile Omega was one of those cars that looked respectable at a glance. The kind of car your neighbor might have bought because he wanted something a little classier than a Chevy. But under the veneer of Oldsmobile's upscale badge was one of the most dangerously under-engineered machines General Motors ever unleashed on the public. Born during GM's notorious era of badge engineering, the Omega shared its body and bones with the Chevrolet Nova, Pontiac Ventura, and Buick Apollo. Yet somehow, despite this shared DNA, the Omega managed to take everything mediocre about its siblings and make it worse.
The Omega's troubles began with its construction. GM's cost-cutting was merciless during the 1970s, and the Omega bore the scars of every budget slash. The front suspension, a critical component for handling and steering stability, was mounted on thin, flexible subframe brackets that tended to tear away after enough stress, sometimes catastrophically. Drivers reported hearing loud pops or clunks just before losing all steering control as the front of the car literally began to separate from the chassis. The steering couplings themselves were prone to failure, which meant that a sudden turn of the wheel could result in nothing happening at all. It was a terrifying flaw the GM largely downplayed, issuing service bulletins but avoiding a full-scale recall. Even when everything was technically working, the Omega was far from safe. Its handling was described by owners as sloppy, boat-like, and completely unpredictable. The front end tended to dive under braking, the rear would fishtail without warning, and in emergency maneuvers, the car seemed to take its own path, independent of the driver's wishes. The power steering was so over-assisted that it offered no feedback at all. You could turn the wheel with one finger, but you never quite knew what the tires were doing beneath you. Combine that with a braking system that faded after only a few hard stops, and you had a car that inspired zero confidence on the highway. Inside, the Omega was supposed to provide a touch of luxury compared to the Nova, but that promise quickly unraveled. The faux wood grain trim peeled off within months, the upholstery disintegrated under sunlight, and electrical systems failed so often that dashboard lights became more of a suggestion than a guarantee. Water leaks were common around the windshield and trunk, leading to mold and corrosion in cars that were only a few years old. Some owners discovered rust forming inside the doors before the warranty even expired. As one particularly bitter Omega owner wrote in a 1977 issue of Car and Driver, "The only thing luxurious about this car is the amount of money it cost me to keep it running." Crash safety was equally grim. The Omega's structure crumpled unevenly in collisions, often transferring the force straight into the passenger compartment. The steering column could collapse inward during a frontal crash, and seat belt mounts were so poorly welded that they sometimes tore free under high impact. In rear collisions, the fuel filler neck, mounted awkwardly near the tail light, was prone to rupture, spraying gasoline beneath the trunk floor. For a car meant to be a practical and stylish alternative to imports, it turned out to be neither stylish, nor practical, nor remotely safe. What made the Omega's story especially tragic was its name. Omega was meant to sound futuristic, almost cosmic, suggesting the pinnacle of Oldsmobile's engineering. Instead, it became a fitting symbol for the end of Oldsmobile's credibility among younger buyers. While Chevrolet could shrug off the Nova's flaws as mass-market compromises, Oldsmobile's customers expected refinement, and what they got was a rebadged time bomb with chrome trim. By the end of the 1970s, the Omega had gained a quiet reputation as a lemon. Mechanics dreaded them, drivers distrusted them, and even dealers were embarrassed to sell them. The car faded into obscurity, overshadowed by GM's larger blunders of the era, but those who remember it recall a vehicle that perfectly embodied everything wrong with the 1970s Detroit. Careless design, cynical marketing, and a deadly combination of weight, weakness, and wishful thinking. Today, the Oldsmobile Omega stands as a forgotten warning from the past, proof that sometimes the difference between luxury and liability is just a badge glued to the grille. By the 1970s, the MGB, once celebrated as a nimble, fun British roadster, had transformed into something far more sinister. The car that had charmed sports car enthusiasts with its lightweight agility, open-top thrill, and mechanical simplicity was now burdened with safety and emissions modifications imposed by U.S. regulations. Rubber, energy-absorbing bumpers, mandated to reduce collision damage, were bolted awkwardly onto the chassis. They didn't just ruin the car's sleek lines, they added substantial weight to the front end, upsetting the MGB's delicate balance and making its handling unpredictable. Many owners reported that the car's nimbleness vanished.
Cornering sharply could now induce sudden understeer or even front-end snap, particularly when driving aggressively on twisty roads. The chassis itself offered almost no protection. Unlike modern vehicles with crumple zones, reinforced rails, and energy-absorbing interiors, the MGB's thin steel tub was utterly rigid and unforgiving. Even minor accidents could result in doors buckling, panels folding, and steering columns collapsing inward, posing a direct threat to the driver and passenger. Side impacts were especially hazardous, as the low-slung body left occupants' heads perilously close to the tarmac or other vehicles' bumpers. Drivers of larger, heavier cars often had a devastating advantage in collisions. The MGB could be easily crushed, climbed over, or telescoped by bigger sedans or trucks, with catastrophic results for its occupants. Compounding the danger, the car's open-top design offered virtually no rollover protection. Without a roll bar, occupants were exposed in accidents that would have been survivable in closed vehicles. The lack of structural reinforcement, combined with the additional weight at the front, also increased the likelihood of flipping in sudden maneuvers or during collisions. Many early reports from U.S. insurance and crash tests noted the car's extremely poor survivability, making it a vehicle that demanded constant caution. Owners often found themselves in a paradoxical situation. The car retained its fun analog driving experience, but every drive carried hidden risk. Enthusiasts would lament that the MGB's charm was now inseparable from its danger, a car that promised freedom and joy, yet delivered vulnerability. Even seasoned British mechanics who restored or raced these cars in the 1970s warned that the new bumpers, heavier front end, and weakened crash structure made the MGB more treacherous than ever. It had become, in many ways, a classic example of how regulatory compliance, when grafted onto a vehicle not designed for it, could unintentionally turn a beloved sports car into a rolling hazard. By the end of the decade, the MGB's reputation in the U.S. had shifted. No longer was it just a lightweight, fun roadster. It was a car whose quirks and flaws could kill. A warning to anyone who forgot that beauty and charm don't always equal safety. Today, restored MGBs are cherished as collectibles, but the 1970s U.S. versions remain a stark reminder of how even a classic icon could become dangerously compromised when pushed through the machinery of legal compliance and market pressure.
The Subaru 360, introduced to American roads in the late 1950s and imported through the early 1970s, is a fascinating case study in both automotive ingenuity and perilous design. Marketed as an economical, reliable, and utterly charming city car, the 360 promised to make personal transportation accessible to millions of Americans, many of whom were intrigued by Japan's post-war automotive innovation. Its compact size, weighing just around 1,300 pounds, 600 kilograms, made it perfect for tight urban environments. It could fit almost anywhere, sip fuel at astonishingly low rates, and was simple enough that even amateur mechanics could service it with minimal tools. On paper, it seemed ideal for the era, affordable, lightweight, and efficient. In reality, the 360 was an astonishingly fragile machine that could turn everyday driving into a game of survival. The body construction was the first major hazard. Unlike the steel-bodied American sedans of the time, the Subaru 360 used extremely thin fiberglass panels to keep weight down and costs low. While clever for economy, this choice left occupants almost completely exposed in the event of a collision. Even low-speed impacts could crumple the car's shell, while moderate collisions often pierced the cabin entirely. The doors, thin and poorly reinforced, could pop open with startling ease if the car was jostled or impacted, instantly exposing passengers to grave danger. Inside, the car offered no real safety provisions. Seatbelts were optional and primitive, the dashboard was rigid and unforgiving, and the steering column had no energy-absorbing design. In short, the 360 was a tin can with wheels, offering minimal protection against the forces of a collision.
Mechanically, the Subaru 360 was designed for gentle city driving, not the high-speed highways of America. Its 356cc air-cooled two-stroke engine produced a mere 16 horsepower, barely enough to maintain safe speeds on modern roads. Acceleration was sluggish, passing larger vehicles required careful timing, and any abrupt maneuver could destabilize the car due to its lightweight chassis and short wheelbase. Drum brakes, standard on all models, were easily overwhelmed, especially under repeated emergency use or downhill runs, leading to dangerously long stopping distances. Its suspension, tuned for comfort over urban streets, offered almost no lateral stability at speed, making sudden turns or evasive maneuvers potentially catastrophic. The 360's handling and safety deficiencies were compounded by driver expectations. Many Americans, used to the heft and crash protection of domestic sedans, underestimated the risks of this minuscule vehicle. A small fender bender or a sudden swerve could result in the cabin crumpling around its occupants. Its nickname, the Death Beetle, spread through automotive circles not as a critique of its charm, but as a sobering acknowledgement of how unforgiving it could be. Even moderately aggressive driving could lead to serious injury or death, a grim paradox for a car meant to democratize mobility and offer freedom to budget-conscious drivers. Yet the 360 endured in the U.S. market for more than a decade, gaining a cult following among city dwellers, college students, and small families who valued fuel economy and practicality over brute force or highway performance. Its influence on Subaru's brand identity in America cannot be overstated. It positioned Subaru as a maker of reliable, efficient, and quirky vehicles and laid the foundation for future successes like the Leon and later the Outback. Despite this, its legacy remains haunted by its dangers. Every collision report, every near miss, and every harrowing story of passengers thrown through flimsy doors highlighted the dark side of early compact imports, that small, economical, and cute vehicles could, in fact, be profoundly deadly. The Subaru 360 represents a collision of contrasts: innovation versus fragility, accessibility versus danger, and charm versus lethal vulnerability. It is remembered fondly for its role in making affordable cars accessible, yet it stands as one of the clearest examples in automotive history of how cutting costs and prioritizing size and economy over fundamental safety can turn a marvel of engineering into a near-death trap. Even today, collectors and enthusiasts admire its quirky design and mechanical simplicity, but every restored 360 carries with it the ghost of its perilous past, a reminder that not all roads, especially American highways, were kind to the world's first people's microcar.
The Fiat Strada, produced between 1978 and 1988, is a perfect example of Italian ambition colliding disastrously with execution. Fiat marketed it as a marvel of modern manufacturing, proudly claiming it was hand-built by robots, a phrase that sounded futuristic and sophisticated at the time. On paper, the Strada was supposed to blend Italian flair with practical design, a compact car with enough style to impress, yet small and economical enough for everyday driving. In reality, the promise ended at the showroom. The so-called robotic assembly was anything but precise. Doors rarely aligned correctly, panels often didn't meet flush, and trim would pop off without warning. Wiring issues were common, with electrical shorts that caused everything from dead headlights to spontaneous fires. It became a car that could fail in dozens of ways, even before being pressed to its limits on the road. When it came to safety, the Strada was brutally unprepared for the real world. Its lightweight frame, combined with thin steel panels, offered almost no crash protection. In minor collisions, the structure would crumple catastrophically, with panels bending inward and sometimes detaching entirely. Occupants were at severe risk in even low-speed impacts. Owners quickly developed a dark sense of humor about the car's fragility. Many joked that the Strada was the only car where the doors could fall off
even without a crash, a testament to both its structural deficiencies and its unpredictable assembly quality. In an era before rigorous European crash testing became standard, cars like the Strada highlighted just how little attention some manufacturers paid to occupant safety, even on vehicles meant for the mass market. Despite these flaws, the Strada persisted in Fiat's lineup for a decade, largely because of its low cost and the Italian public's tolerance for quirky mechanical issues. Enthusiasts who managed to keep one running often did so with constant repairs, makeshift fixes, and a considerable amount of luck. Its reputation for unreliability and unpredictability spread quickly. Mechanics and owners alike regarded it as a constant source of headaches, a car that demanded attention even for the simplest of errands. While it occasionally drew praise for its compact dimensions and nimble city maneuverability, any potential benefits were overshadowed by its dangerous tendencies and shocking lack of durability. The Fiat Strada remains a fascinating relic of late 1970s automotive experimentation. It represents a period when manufacturers chased high-tech assembly claims and flashy marketing without ensuring fundamental reliability or safety. Its failures, both mechanical and structural, made it a running joke for drivers and mechanics alike, yet it also offered a window into Fiat's willingness to innovate, even if that innovation was more tragic-comic than triumphant. Today, surviving Stradas are rare, and when found, they serve as a reminder of an era when style, ambition, and marketing could easily outpace engineering, creating a car that was as notorious for its dangers as it was memorable for its odd charm.
The Citroen Ami 8, produced between 1969 and 1978, stands as one of the most fascinating yet perilously unsafe vehicles of its era, perfectly embodying the contradictions of post-war European automotive engineering. At first glance, the Ami 8 was whimsical, quirky, and instantly recognizable. Its sharply angular body, reversed-raked rear window, and unusual sloping lines made it stand out on the streets of Paris, Lyon, and Marseille. It was the kind of car that drew attention, not for its power or speed, but for its sheer personality. Citroën promoted it as a practical, economical city car, perfectly suited for narrow roads, tight parking spaces, and drivers who prioritized charm and efficiency over brute performance. Its two-cylinder air-cooled engine, while modest in output, offered adequate city mobility and exceptional fuel efficiency, further endearing it to a post-oil crisis European audience that valued frugality. Yet beneath its playful and seemingly harmless exterior, the Ami 8 concealed structural vulnerabilities that made it frighteningly unsafe. The body was constructed from extremely thin-gauge steel, which offered almost no protection in collisions. Even low-speed impacts could deform the cabin, crush occupants, and send body panels buckling inward. Side collisions were particularly hazardous. The Ami 8 lacked reinforced doors or a substantial side frame, causing the vehicle to fold dramatically like an accordion. Frontal collisions, though less common in city driving, could be catastrophic because the rigid steering column and unpadded dashboard transmitted the force directly into the driver's torso. French crash tests in the early 1970s documented these dangers, revealing that even minor accidents could result in the steering wheel penetrating the driver's chest, making survivability far lower than in contemporary larger European or American vehicles. Handling was another hidden risk. The Ami 8 employed a soft, almost floating suspension intended to smooth the ride over cobblestone streets and uneven pavements. While innovative for comfort, it compromised stability at speed. Sudden evasive maneuvers, tight turns, or emergency braking could destabilize the car, increasing the likelihood of a rollover or uncontrollable slide. Its light weight, which contributed to its remarkable fuel economy, also made it prone to being pushed around by wind, larger vehicles, or uneven road surfaces. Drivers often reported an unnerving sense of instability on faster rural roads or highways, a reminder that while the Ami 8 excelled in style and economy,
it sacrificed fundamental safety. Despite these dangers, the Ami 8 carved out a devoted following. It became a favorite among young drivers, city dwellers, and budget-conscious families who appreciated its combination of affordability, unique aesthetics, and surprisingly comfortable ride for a car of its size. Citroen's engineers had integrated innovative touches, such as the hydro-pneumatic suspension system, which allowed the car to maintain a level stance regardless of load, and provided a smooth, almost luxurious ride, uncommon in subcompact cars of the time. The interior, though sparse, had enough character to make it feel alive, a little spaceship of practicality, which contrasted sharply with the raw mechanical reality beneath. Owners cherished these quirky features, even as they remained painfully aware of the car's limitations. From a historical perspective, the Ami 8 serves as a vivid reminder of an era when automotive design often prioritized creativity, economy, and novelty over occupant protection. In today's context, it would be deemed extraordinarily unsafe. Yet, in its time, it represented a balance, however precarious, between innovation and risk. Its legacy is complicated. It is remembered fondly for its charm, its role in democratizing mobility in post-war France, and its clever engineering solutions, but also feared and respected for its shocking vulnerability in accidents. Surviving Ami 8s, often restored by enthusiasts, carry with them both nostalgia and cautionary lessons. They are relics of a period when cars were mechanical expressions of national character and ingenuity, yet when safety standards were minimal, human lives were perilously exposed, and the thin steel of a tiny French hatchback could not hope to protect its occupants. In the end, the Citroen Ami 8 is more than just a small car. It is a symbol of a time when style and economy often collided disastrously with the brutal realities of physics. It captured the imagination of drivers with its charm and clever engineering, yet every drive carried an inherent risk. Its enduring appeal lies in this duality, a vehicle that could enchant and endanger in equal measure, embodying both the whimsical spirit and the dangerous naivete of mid-20th century European automotive engineering. Even decades later, the Ami 8 remains a study in contrasts, delicate yet spirited, innovative yet hazardous, iconic yet terrifying, reminding us that automotive history is never just about beauty or utility, but also about the hidden costs of neglecting safety.